observation here in the United States, but also in Europe and in other countries of what's going on. We've been under, quote, a lockdown for quite a while. I would say over 6 months. And really what this has done to our whole economy is there is a movement toward virtual platforms, which means the value of facilities now has gone down because people are working at home. And so universities and other organizations which have put heavy investment into the infrastructure and buildings, et cetera, are finding that they have a problem because their funding mechanism is putting students into the university, at the university, selling them food, parking, all this expenses, and now all of a sudden, they have a challenge because we're moving to virtual platforms. And it's gone into the industry now, and it's caused people to look at things differently. By observation, because we've been in a lockdown, and because the whole supply chain has really been shut down for a while, it's coming back up, but it's slow to come up. The emphasis now on price becomes much greater. And so with the emphasis on price being greater because the organizations don't have the funding anymore. So they have to cut they've had their funds cut. So now what they're doing is they want something at a lower cost. Cost has become paramount. It's the most important thing to them. And of course, we in the United States have seen this, but there is a movement to automate everything that people can automate. And if I can give a good description of what automation is the replacement of human activity, including the processing capability of a human being is, quote, now called artificial intelligence, and it becomes the brains of any type of automation, which includes robotics. Of course, we have seen unemployment go up. And as much as everybody in the world wants to say that we're going to get back up to speed and everyone will get their jobs back, I do not believe that that is an accurate statement, because we have seen what automation has done, especially here in the United States. In construction, there's been shutdown of projects. There've been delay in projects. There've been awards in projects, but it's a hard time getting these projects going. And of course now, I believe everyone knows the definition of furloughs. Furloughs is where you still have a job, but you're not getting paid. And this causes havoc in the industry. Now, the technical part of the impact of COVID is what is required by the governments in this environment. Social distancing, PPE, practices which increase the cost and cut down the efficiency of our construction systems. So how have the organizations reacted? Simple. Cut costs. And I think they still have an attempt to keep the most valuable employees. So let me touch on this. When COVID hit, a lot of the organizations in some of the states immediately, for example, in the tourism industry, which is huge, immediately laid everyone off. Then what they told their people is, we are going to open up. And while we're waiting to open up, we want everyone to apply for your jobs, giving them the capability now to minimize the number of people that they have to just the best people. And this has been going on all over the place. And so there are some people now who have more value who will get their jobs back, but there are other people who may not. So what's the state of our construction industry in all this mayhem going on? Well, you all can read the slide. For the last 40 years, we know that these are observations of the construction industry. One thing I'd like to touch on, and it will come up again, and this is very unique because in the construction industry, we have a client-centric operation, which means the client is at the center. The client tells the vendors what to do. In order to do this and mitigate their risk, they have created a system of professionals, which include architects, engineers, project managers, and now procurement folks are also considered as the professionals. This system, which they've set up to deliver services and mitigate risk, has a severe problem. It cannot tell the difference. And we'll be touching on this further on in the presentation. And then, because the risk quote is so high now, because we have an entity, and I love to use my hands. So the easiest way to do this is say, if this is the client and their representatives, and this here is the expert vendor, should the client and the representatives be telling the expert vendor what to do? This is as simple as it gets. If the expert vendor is truly an expert, the expert vendor should not need a lot of instruction. Who should be writing the scope of work and identifying exactly what should happen? Should it be the client who has the requirement, or should it be the expert vendor? Logic tells us it should be the expert vendor. But I believe that over 90% of our industry, we still have the client and their representatives telling the vendors what to do. And because they're doing this, they now have made the assumption that all the vendors are the same. And therefore, if all the vendors are the same and they all understand the requirement, the only thing that matters is cost. So they want the lowest cost. This is a huge problem caused by this system set up by the clients. So because of the huge risk, and everybody knows what the risk can be, we have to find ways now to mitigate this risk. And so we've come up with all kinds of relationship-based supply deliveries, from alliance contracting to IPD in the United States, PPP, and now we are beginning to see, even before the pandemic, the results of these types of systems, and it hasn't been pretty. This is a slide from one of my graduate students at Schema. Basically, you can look at the bottom and you see it's the construction against the economy against manufacturing, and the real gross value added per hour worked, right? And construction hasn't moved. They have all kinds of charts on this. I even saw something coming out of the UK that said, you know, we have a problem, and the problem is our industry has not learned how to add value. It's a real problem. Then you go over on something that drives efficient, high-performing organizations, and that is profit. And take a look at the profit margins. Where do we find construction? Pretty low. Tells you the same thing here. And then everybody has their own list of jobs that took like forever to build. You know, this goes on, and we'll be covering a few of these. And then what's really important is we want continuity. So we want, quote, the vendors who are in our organization in our industries, in our supply chains. We want them to stay in business. It builds stability. It builds expertise. So we just look at bankruptcies or insolvencies. And where do we find construction? This is not a pretty picture. This is by observation. This is going on. So we know we have an issue. Right? Once again, it's a client-centric driven industry, and it utilizes a system of professionals. Now, what does this mean? What this means, and I am a professional civil engineer, besides having my PhD and besides having a lot of, quote, experience in the industry. This means that individuals who want to be a professional in our industry must go and get educated. They go through 3-4 years, get educated. Then they have a requirement for minimal experience, and then they go for certification. Once they get the certification, they're all the same. This system cannot tell the difference. Simply put, in this system that the professionals are running, cost is the only differentiator to get a project, or it should be to get the project. So basically now, because it can't tell the difference and the risk is so high, the clients now put a premium on learning how to form relationships, which now they have to manage, direct, and control. And then they try to put trust in here to minimize the risk. Logically speaking, if we had more time, these things are not congruent. These items cause risk, right? And that's why the industry in general has not performed well. Putting it simply, I came up with this slide over 25 years ago. If you look at performance in competition, if it's client-centric, it means that the client is trying to tell the vendors what to do. The client is now responsible because they told the vendors what to do. They're actually responsible for the risk. But what they try to do is by contract, they try to move that risk. But anybody knows, you can't move risk. It's like saying to somebody who has no expertise and can't see, you need to mitigate the risk. That's not a possibility. So then they find ways to try to form a relationship. They try to find ways to work together. They find ways to try to trust each other more. But the results have not been good. Now, if we want high performance, the answer is extremely simple. But it goes against this whole system set up by the clients to mitigate risk. What it means is somehow we must identify and utilize expertise. Wow. In other words, this has to be minimized from the client. And they haven't figured a way how to do this. So then they've tried to say, well, let's work together. Or let's trust each other. Or let's work earlier together. But this does not mitigate risk, because when you have a whole group working together, the accountability goes down. And a lot of the problems here in the United States, and you'll see some drastic cases that have just happened, it's because everybody tried to trust each other, but when push came to shove and somebody had to pay the $50 million price tag for the risk, guess where it ended up? In court. And many of the contractors now, the big ones, the ones who are dominant in our industry, have come across now a problem. They can't afford to take this risk and to pay for the risk. So what ends up happening is, as the client tries to do this, but they really can't tell the difference. What they've told the industry is, this is our minimum requirement, and we want something better than that. Well, the vendors, they've been around. This is a business. So what the vendors have done, they turned a minimum into a maximum and they drive the performance down. Why? Because the only factor that dictates who gets the job is price. Now, what has happened with this is now the professionals have even more of a job, because now they have to make sure that what they got is not too much lower than the minimum that they required. But it gives us a situation. This is not a win-win. Now I'm going to show you something that, because I'm so old and I don't remember when I showed this last to the worldwide groups, many of you have never seen this before. But we have something in the United States called ASTMs. So whenever any material is sold in the United States, there is an ASTM standard for it. And I was shocked on how this standard is set. What they do is, when they want to, quote, identify a standard for a material, any of the suppliers, the manufacturers who supply this material, who are huge, get together along with professionals, and they try to identify what the standard should be. This is the standard setting for a silicone waterproofing material, exterior. And you can see on the left-hand side all the physical properties. Initial elongation, tensile strength, final elongation, permeance, weathering, et cetera, et cetera. And A through F stands for the largest manufacturers who are trying to sell their material. Now, what ends up happening is, once they set the properties, they identify an ASTM test method. For example, with elongation, they just clamp a material that's yay thick and yay wide, and they keep pulling it till it breaks. Where it breaks is the number that they record. That's simple enough for everyone to understand. So we have elongation, we have tensile strength, et cetera, right? And they just, every manufacturer now, which I didn't realize, goes back to their own laboratory, creates their own sample, tests their own material based on the agreed upon instructions, and then they return with, quote, their data of their material. Now, what they set for the standard and how they pick it is truly astounding. I actually sat in this meeting. The manufacturer who wanted to get his performance into the industry told me, Dr. Dean, you need to be there. You need to sit there and actually see it with your own eyes. What they were doing was picking the lowest number in every category. I looked at that and I said, this increases risk. This doesn't minimize risk. So I asked the leader of the group, why are we doing this? Why don't we do in-field testing, identify which criteria actually impact on the performance, and go from there? And he said, Dr. Dean, we have been sued. We have been sued by a manufacturer who didn't meet the standard in a previous standard setting activity. And when they were called in court to identify why, quote, according to a certain criteria, why their number was too low, no one could answer the question. And because they couldn't answer the question, and because they had to change what they were doing, what they now do is they pick the lowest possible number. And so they take all the criteria and all the lowest numbers, then set the standard. I believe it's done like this in every country with every standard setting committee, because I've actually gone to a couple of them and asked them. And sometimes I get the answer, no, where the risk is high, we actually have good numbers. I said, walk me through one of these examples. And it came back to, we made a decision. And when we make decisions, it always causes risk. So now what happens? Well, you have the standard being set by numbers that come from all different materials. It doesn't even represent a single material. Then what each manufacturer is faced with, they now go back and look at their material. They now look at the standard. And then they realize that the cheapest material is going to get the most business. So they now take their, quote, performance down to the floor. And this is how they set the minimum requirement in everything that is sold in the construction industry. And why do I bring this up? I bring this up because this system of professionals, where they go to school, they have minimal experience, they get certified, this system that they continue to proliferate cannot tell the difference. And because it can't tell the difference, there is no justification for considering performance. It has to go to price. So everywhere where this is run, and if they say, no, this doesn't make sense, we're going to, quote, go back to trusting the vendor or cooperating with the vendor or allowing the vendor now to drive this whole thing. No longer will it be client-centric. We want the vendor to utilize their expertise and do this. They don't have a mechanism to do that because the system of professionals can't tell the difference. That is the problem we face in the construction industry. Now, there's millions of examples with this, but this one is blatantly obvious. In the 1980s and 1990s, this is the spec for the #1 sold single-ply roofing material in the United States. And you look at, quote, their values, tensile strength, over 2,000 PSI, elongation, 300%. It can, quote, meet the ASTM standard in brittleness. It can go down to -30 degrees centigrade. This thing is going to last forever. If you install this roofing system, you never have to worry about the roof again, which in facilities, waterproofing problems is a huge problem for facility managers. Well, what happened to this system? Well, on a cold, very cold night in Grand Rapids, Michigan, 100 of these roofs exploded on the same night. Totally unexpected. This was a shock to the industry. Why? Because this system had met all the ASTM requirements. One year after shattering was confirmed, the roofing system was still the #1 seller and specified by the architectural systems. Then, in short order, the NRCA, which is the governing body for roofing, which has all the technical standards, all the requirements, issued a bulletin directing owners, if you have this roofing system, we recommend you to replace it immediately. And then they took the ASTM standard and they modified it. Many people don't even know these things go on because they don't have the experience.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel for more content. If you have any questions about the best value approach or for Dr. Dean, leave them in the comment section below and we'll get to them in a later video. Thanks, we'll see you next time.